So I've brought with me right now a promised bridge, and yeah, my research has very often been about bridges or bridging, and I'm going to actually talk to you about that, filling this metaphor in the next 30 minutes or so. I want to tell you the fun fact that I just took this photo on the way to my office when I was crossing the Rhine River, so you get an impression of the weather conditions here in Basel at about 8 o'clock p.m. It's the old bridge. Right. Today I'm going to talk to you about digital humanities for fiction, and I'm going to start with the introduction in which I remind you or introduce to you what fiction is about and why it's interesting to study fiction generally, but also digitally. And then I'm going to introduce a little bit, as I said, in a way to little studies or aspects of doing digital humanities for fiction. So already now I'd like to ask you to ask questions, even though they're not related directly to my talk, or then I'm going to introduce a case study to you. It's a little bit of suspense right now, what this is going to be about, and then conclusions, and then hopefully a lot of questions and answers. First of all, before we get started, I'd like to do this little experiment. I hope it works. So if you can scan this QR code or type in menti.com and then enter this code that you can see right now, we can do a little interactive a little interaction. Can you see it? Is it working?
I'm trying to.
Okay. Let's try not to take too much time for that, but maybe wait.
Yeah. I got it.
Okay. Okay, now I see a little bit of how you read and when you talk about reading. So everybody can see these bar plots, right?
She has to share the screen.
She's not sharing this screen?
Can you see it?
Look at here.
Oh. Apparently I did something here that switched the order of the screens. I'm sorry, Berenike, let me just try to fix this.
Yeah, but I'm seeing that notes are coming in, so
how can I switch this around? So where is this?
Clicking on the image twice.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. I think it's okay now.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we get an impression, and we can look at the full data later on. But it seems right now that this audience prefers, communicating about books with friends, colleagues, and family, to kind of more formal things like book clubs or like social media versions on online platforms such as Goodreads, Lovely Books, or Wattpad, or Reddit. Okay, so I'm now going back to the slides and start my talk. All right, so what is fiction? And what can digital humanities actually tell us about fiction? Fiction, and I'm just going to do this, okay. And digital humanities, when we approach fiction, so when we, when literary scholars and data scientists and corpus linguists and computational linguists talk about fiction, it's kind of within digital humanities, it's important to start off with something in Latin, because just to mark our heritage, right, our humanistic heritage. But this is, of course, no arbitrary quote. It's one of the first definitions of fiction, which is to instruct, and to delight. So it's a definition talking about the functions, the presumed functions of fictional discourse. Now, of course, there's a lot of variation throughout the centuries ever since Horace's first definition, both in the functions of fiction and in the very concept of fiction or of literature. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a strong, view of fiction as artistically crafted language. So the artistical craftiness was in the focus. But later, the probability of science, really the formal side of fiction, was in the focus. We are also normally talking about fiction in a written form, not so much today, at least, in the oral forms. Of course, the functions, as I said, have varied too. So, right now, we, of course, think about pleasure and entertainment, about meaning making, both in terms of, making meaning in life. Why? So actually answering the question, why do people, take the pain of buying books and reading them in some form and going from one cover to the other? Or, it seems like there is something up with rendering narrative structure and sense to otherwise contingent events in our everyday life, and to offer spaces for reflection about life. But the instructional function, of Horace's, the instruct function, has also been revived lately, talking about ethical development, critical thinking and empathy, and social cohesion and therapeutic effects. And more generally, as a source of learning, which actually might be an evolutionary type of learning too, through, in the development of the species even. So, for example, the Reader project, run by Jane Davis in Liverpool, is one wonderful project that puts into practice all these ideas about literature, about fiction, and actually finds it helps people in these ways. In another way, fiction is currently described and defined by reference to these four categories: to author, to the text, to context in which all this happens, situated historically, or socially, and of course to the reader. So these are just examples, but typically, there are ideas about authors distinguishing themselves, within the literary field, for example, as Bourdieu says, within groups, out of groups, and so on. So using language in order to be different, to be interesting, to do something that makes him unique, and to carry on with art. The next category, the text, I mentioned that before, of observable features that make a verbal message a work of art. This is very formal, a formal way, and has from the start had a quantitative dimension. And this is, of course, also about change and dispersion throughout, time and across genres, for example, or audiences and different languages, and so on. Audiences, for example, being children versus adults, or certain other audiences. Then the context. The context is really, of course, a broad, category here. But when we look at the context, when we're more interested in contextual aspects of fiction, then we are probably interested in how fiction takes part in reflecting on societies and beliefs and actually sometimes molding them, right? Think about national literature, think about canonicity, so reading lists, policy, what has to be read, and so on. In many different nations, for example. But it's at the same time also about the experiential world, so about what's surrounding people and how this is rendered, how this is in history some approaches have actually said it's kind of a mirroring or a direct mapping of the world. But of course, now we have a more abstract approach to that and say it's more of a representation in which the world appears in fiction, right? But it's super crucial. You have social, emotional, and the palpable world as contexts. And then finally, last but not least, and you see it's in bold letters here, the reader. I put it in bold because I'm going to focus on this today. So thinking about the function, right? So why do people experience pleasure when reading? Why do they like imagining non-factual things? Why do they like the palpability of signs, right? For example, in rhymes and metaphors and puns, right? Different types of signs and palpabilities. And then finally, what's going on with billions of people on the internet actually doing social reading? So sharing their opinions about books, but also writing online, commenting, and so on. In in closely knit communities sometimes, or sometimes broader communities. Right. So definition of fiction and why fiction is interesting. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit what does it mean, digital humanities for fiction. So of course, computational and formal and quantitative methods, often called distant reading. That is one of those telltale notions in digital humanities for fiction. Distant reading, as opposed to this close reading, which we treat as a default in literary studies, right? Close reading, one book, page by page, and so on, versus transforming books into data and then into aggregates of data and spreadsheets and so on, and then running analyses on millions of books and saying something. It's really, of course, a big difference. So distant reading, rather bigger, data sets and so on. But there is this mixed methods aspect, of course, where you scale from small data sets, even from the text itself and the page and so on. Of course, below that too, to these large volumes in the big corpora. So, and corpora and statistics is, of course, sine qua non in digital humanities for fiction. And yes, so we're building on the basis of corpus linguistics, of natural language processing, of computational linguistics and stylistics. And of course, right now, things are really moving very quickly with data science. Machine learning, word embeddings, and all these things are also streaming into digital humanities for fiction. So it's a great time. It's also going quite quickly. So another aspect which is important and crucial is annotation. For example, of metaphor or of subjectivity, concreteness, and so on. Part of speech. Part of speech, as you know, is something that is for most languages really a solved problem. So we can normally just use a tagger. For German, for example, the tree tagger. And if we don't have such a thing as, for example, such as for metaphor, we do manual annotation and then also do that in a formal way. There are many people, an increasing group of, or it's not really a group, but increasing number of people who use machine learning in digital humanities for fiction. And interestingly, we got now more and more research questions, and we got a more and more research question-driven research in digital humanities for fiction. My colleagues and I have just written down an overview of this latter thing, so research questions. We hope it's, this paper is going to be published soon in this kind of book, the Handbook of Empirical Literary Studies. And below you see our category, our system, our taxonomy of types of research questions. approaching literature with digital, with computational means. So you see formalist approaches, social approaches, cognitive approaches. If you have questions about that, please ask them. As I said, we build on a firm basis, actually. And many people now listening to that will probably identify what this is, and maybe you even identify which dimension of Douglas's Fibers multidimensional analysis is portrayed here. Do you know? It's the first dimension, involved versus information production, and you can see that fiction is, of course, on there. It's kind of in the middle between the face-to-face conversation, telephone conversations on the one hand, and the official documents on the other hand. And kind of seems a little bit as a balanced or a non-marked register here in its different genres. Because there are, of course, involved aspects in there, but there's also informational aspects in there. Taking up on that, I've looked in a very, very small corpus, but an interesting, I think, corpus on narrative beginnings in German literature of the turn of the century, of the 20th century. So from 1880 to 1930, I've looked at part of speech and how it is distributed in the beginnings of fictional narratives. And you can see very slight, but still significant correlations for the different parts of speech. And you might recognize that they kind of show an informal, so tendency over time. Here, time is on the x-axis. A tendency through time within this corpus of fiction becoming more informal, right? It's a very small data set, but I found it interesting, and this is the kind of thing that is a pilot study, an exploratory, more or less, study on which we will build on bigger corpora and also with different statistical models. Okay, I'd like you, if you want to go for another survey really quickly, because it's going to be so interesting, if you fill this out. So this one looks like this. Another QR code. I mean, I think it's the same QR code in the same code. So you can just go to the next slide if you want. And enter your answers. And then we'll see who's going to win in the end. I hope this is working. As I said, it's a little bit of an experiment. Oh yes, people are answering, right? So we see a little battle there. Interesting. Okay, just keep on, please. Keep on doing that. It's also a bit of a priming thing for you to get into, the mood of my case study. Okay. So the case study, you probably have had already formed an idea of what this is going to be about. It's on evaluation of readers, so lay readers on the web. So what do people do on the web when they engage in these reading platforms? So we just took one of these platforms in German. You can see it here. It's a screenshot of the front page of, it's called Lovely Books. It has this English, title, and it's one of these projects that Tony mentioned in the beginning, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And so our research question is on the evaluation of fiction. Interestingly, so when you go onto this web page, this platform, and you look at how do they present themselves, this is the way how they do that. So we say we all love talking about books, recommending them to our friends, or sharing our criticism when we did not like them. So it's about evaluation. Lovely Books is the place on the internet where all of this is possible, the home of book lovers and reading aficionados. Nice that you are here. So it's a very welcoming tone, right? So this is our project with my dear colleagues, Thomas Messerli, Simone Rebora, Gregor Bachmann, and Johanna Meyer. And we look at, we've built a corpus from this webpage. And first of all, we had this open question about what do people do when they evaluate literature on a social reading platform. And they write about their writing experience, and they have to assign star ratings, right? They have to say, okay, 4, 5, 3 to 1 stars. And they, of course, are being very social, so they interact. Another question that came up really quickly was, what does the ordinal scale of rating mean? So there's 5 stars, 4 stars, and so on. And then the next question was, what role do the fiction genres play that people read and then talk about? So is there any variation across, these genres, right? So this research that I'm now talking about is not about the literary works, but it's about people's evaluation, people's texts, evaluating them. You can see these 2 URLs there of the wider network in which this research is embedded. And of course, I have to talk about the values, because the values were really the driving point in the beginning. We were coming really from literary studies. We were interested in the values, so really a Kantian approach, aesthetics, philosophy, what values are underlying people's actions when they do engage in that online practice. As I said, there is this research network, which is also international, and we've written up kind of our, take on things on digital humanities and digital social reading in this paper that you can see there too. Okay, so as to the definition of evaluation of fiction, there's one, for example, saying, okay, this is about selecting, functionally describing and interpreting, and thus evaluating artful literary objects, which are the literary texts. This is a definition which is about traditional, literary criticism, really professional literary criticism published in journals and newspapers and so on. And Heidebond and Winkel, which is our main reference here, they define it as to deem an object or property of an object, so the literary object, the book, for example, valuable on the basis of an axiological scale, which is a value scale. So this is really about what's underlying these actions. This is the book, you can see it there, Einführung in die Wertung von Literatur. And they describe evaluative practice in literary communication, and they have this made it so interesting for us from the digital humanities point of view. They have a very formal typology of basic values, so abstract concepts, underlying everything that people do concerning the value of evaluation of literature, which boils down to basically values relating to the form of literature. So for example, the metaphors, the content, right? So the plot or how something is described, is that really a good description of today's, world, or effect related? So this makes me feel good. I feel like I have a friend, this book is my friend, and so on. They make a distinction about historical and contemporary practices. And this is how their typology looks in German, but I've provided an English translation so you can have a quick look. I'm not going to lead you through it, but just to give you an impression of, you know, this is formal, and our idea, our research idea, was to implement this in a quantitative study or in a formal digital study. So back to lovely books, right? This typology, as you probably saw, was written in 1996, so there was no lovely books around by then, and now we apply it to this new kind of data. A brief introduction to what people have talked about, you know, the metrics of evaluation, this way of talking about books or communicating about not just books, of course, but any other kind of products, right? Kind of metrically with signs of order and rating. And there is a kind of a contraposition which says, okay, this is a reductive practice, that people who engage in that are actually producing a commodified self that is simulated, that produces simulated self based on the external statistical world, and which actually produces an adaptation of taste, so that the taste that people have is actually produced by the system and not like coming from the people. Now, on the other hand, people say, okay, it's kind of, scales and lists and so on. This can actually be an empowerment for people. It might value, channel, and select things that would otherwise have, no structurally, and float undifferentiated often. So this might actually be something for people who are not trained literary scholars, for example, or, doing other things. Or it might actually have some, feedback to other aspects of life. So render structure and also provide a communicative grid. So the question is that so? Almost an anecdote is that even in the 18th century, people have produced lists and have, formally defined kind of the value of literature in a, from today's perspective, a bit funny way. But you might identify Goethe, and Schiller, and you can see that Goethe is in almost all points, all categories, higher rated than Schiller, except for wit. So there's Goethe has a 16, whereas Schiller has a 17. Whatever, the unit is, I don't know, but it's interesting. Okay, so on to our corpus. We built this corpus from this webpage, which is of course growing, but at a certain point we decided, okay, this is it. And we have 1.3 million reviews across 15 genres, right? So readers' reviews on the genres. Our data include the ordinal ratings from 1 to 5, of course, the texts with their lexis and syntax, and we also run sentiment analysis. And this is all at the surface of the discourse. And we are working on identifying, revealing the conceptual, symbolic level of discourse and the values and value systems. So this is the corpus. We, as I said, 1.3 million texts. There are 54,000 users, 439 or almost 440 million tokens, and you can see, and so on. And as I said, 15 genres, and these are the genres. I provided a translation here, and you can see that 3/4 of all books, of all reviews fall into the first 5 genres. So this altogether is 75%. You can, the pie chart really tells you the story again in a bit of a different way, but youth literature, crime novels like general category novels, fantasy novels, and romance novels. You can see a skewness here in the data. So these are all the reviews shown by the category, the star category, so 5 stars, 4 stars, and so on. And you can see that, another pattern in here. So most reviews are 5 stars or 4 stars, and then, almost, a very small fraction is 1 star. But again, at the same time, it's kind of big data. So we have interesting data here also on the lower star ratings. Just to show you, that would be a normal distribution, which we don't have. We have the skewed one. So to sum up at this point, we have mostly young adult, crime, novel, fantasy, and romance reviews in this corpus. We have a lot of children's literature, erotic literature, historical novels, and nonfiction. And very few poems, drama, comic, which is basically graphic novels, I would say, classical novels, such as, Goethe, for example, sci-fi, humoristic literature, and biography. And you have this heavy bias, which is really known from this type of online review. It's not something that we, discovered and others don't. So it's kind of the zip flaw of online reviews. But of course, we have to be cautious. Is that really a population of Web 2.0 reviews or on literature, or is that just our platform? We did kind of an exploratory analysis. You can see that we have really tiny effect sizes, but nevertheless, we decided we want to look into the data using the chi-square test and residuals. You can look here at the residuals, and you can see on the horizontal level the genres. So down below, you see printed them out in almost full words, and above it's just the abbreviation. And you see that we have the youth literature quite big, and just the same data in another format. And on the vertical axis, you have the star ratings starting at the bottom with 5 stars and then going all the way up to 1 star. And you get an impression of how the reviews are distributed across the ratings and across the genres. Now we can look at the standardized residuals, or Pearson residuals, and the standardized residuals also. And you can see that for now, just let us focus on the 5-star rating at the bottom, which I have marked. Which of the genres deviate positively from the expected counts, right? So you have children's literature really positively. You also have fantasy, you have the biographies, and the nonfiction with what I there call textbooks, and then the biography to the left. Also romance novels and historical novels, and even poems and drama a little bit, right? So these are more often positive, very positive, 5-star positive, than could be expected on the basis of the chi-square test of chance. If we look at the deviation in the opposite direction, we see that crime, humor, and the general novels and sci-fi deviate negatively, so they are less frequent. The reviews on these genres are less frequent than could be expected in the 5-star ratings, so they're less enthusiastic, it seems. And this is interesting. So first approach to what do people do on these platforms? They seem to rate enthusiastically in the 5-star category very often. For children's literature, people are really overwhelmed positively, also for romance and fantasy, then graphical novels, historical novels, also poetry and drama, and then the nonfiction. And kind of substantially less often they are in this way enthusiastic in assigning the 5 stars for the genres crime, for the general novel, humor, and sci-fi. So this is a practice of reading and rating books by genre on the web, and it seems to have to do with expectations of people and with their, of course, underlying values that they put to literature. Are they oriented on to effects? Do they want the literature to make them feel something, or experience something intellectually? Are they interested in the forms more, which might be the case for depends. For example, crimes, they might think about the plot, right, more, which could be an aspect of form. All this might also depend on the conventions of reviewing. So, do you normally express yourself very, enthusiastically? Or, I mean, this has to be taken into account too. People buy the books or somehow get a hold of them, and they read them, and they put a lot of energy into that, and then they even write on them, or they take, the pain, as it were, to do some, reviewing on them. So all these factors have to be considered, of course. But I want to also report on something that we did in research, kind of tacitly. We thought, okay, when we now analyze this, we kind of think, okay, 1 to 2 stars negative, 3 stars should be kind of neutral, and 4 to 5 stars positive. Even though we have this kind of quantitative skew in there, but in terms of the meaning, right, of this ordinal scale, this could be about it. But is it? So what we use to kind of get the beginning of an answer here is one of the many sentiment analysis tools. This one is 𝗪𝗪, using these lists of words. So it's a word list based sentiment analysis, not one of the new ones, the word embedding ones like using Burton. So no, this is a simple word list which uses these kinds of words that you can see here for positive and negative values. And we did a chi-square test, and here are the residuals again. So actually what you see here is pointing, the results pointing to it's not the way that we thought about the ordinal scale. So you can see here that for the 5-star, let's focus again on the 5-star ratings, that the negative sentiment is underrepresented in the 5-star rating. So, which is, what one would assume, right? 5-star ratings should mean that people have a very positive evaluation of the books that they judge there. So, and vice versa, the positive ratings are really overrepresented. But what happens here is that the negative ratings for every other star category are overrepresented, mirrored by the underrepresentation of the positive words. And this is showing that it's just the 5 stars that are really positive, and 1 to 4 stars is something, but it seems to be more negative. So yes, that doesn't really say much. It's the beginning of research ideas. So what we then did, we did keenness analysis using the package poll miner in R, basically, and this is the result of the keenness analysis. And I just kind of copy pasted the first 20 or 21 ranks from the keenness analysis here, which are so keenness analysis using log likelihood, showing the words that are significantly overrepresented, including punctuation, as you can see on rank number 1 per star rating category. So this shows the 5 stars, so the excellence group. And as you can tell from from the data from the words, people are being emphatic. So maybe briefly, the keyword analysis compared the 5 stars to all the other star categories. So rendering lexis, word use, this is lemmata, that are distinctive of this category of reviews, right? Reviews that were assigned 5 stars. So we have emphatic language here, exclamation marks, but also in terms of, the meaning of the words, utterly, absolute, marvelously, groovy, and so on and so on. So we have extreme statements of valence, and we have a lot of arousal. So there's a lot of, people are, have a lot of, highly pitched there. The statements are there are many very general statements like absolutely, absolute, utterly, and so on. It's direct recommendation. You can see here the reading recommendation kind of in the middle. They talk about it. It comes up here. It's effect oriented. So the words that people use, even these first 20, 21 word forms here, you can see the rapture and the pleasure in there. They also talk about body parts, the heart, which might be a metonymy, metaphor, and also the hand. And the hand could be the hand that holds the book. I couldn't put it out of my hand, which would be, something in German people might say very often. Interestingly, we comes up here. So the pronoun, which is a communal subject, people people who assign 5 stars seem to construct themselves in a community. At least this exploration, seems to point there. And as a tendency, it's not very differentiated, right? So up onto the 4 stars, you can see here again the first 20 ranks of the keenness analysis using log likelihood. Therefore, these words are overrepresented in 4 stars when compared to all the other categories. And interesting. So you have a lot of pronouns here. You have a lot of lexis that is used for referring to the degree of something. You have a lot of concession and limitation. You have general, fairly good, words. So the meaning of the words point to fairly good evaluation. So it's not enthusiastic, but it's good, interesting, and I liked, and so on. And you can see references to this metric system. So the word deduction here, Abzug in German, is like I took away like 1 star or something like that. That's something they say often. And even the word for probably for 4 stars comes up too. So what we look at here, for example, also point of criticism, weakness, the words that we see here seem to point to acts of criticism and deliberation. As a tendency, people at 4 stars are more distanced, are critical, are not enthusiastic, it's all about however and so on, and degree. So then 3 stars seems to all to be about mediocrity. You can see it starts off with unfortunately. And interestingly, we get here not a communal subject, but an overuse of the individual perspective. So there is some overlap with the 4 stars. You can see a lot of pronouns here and expressions of degree, concession, limitation again. But the difference to the 4 stars is that there is negative judgment in the 3 stars. So the unfortunately and the verbose. And then, as I said, there's an individual perspective. And there is lexis that refers to mediocrity. Also, we find negation, not. And we also see the absence, really, of positive evaluation. So as a tendency, these reviews seem to use typically a more differentiated lexis, and it's clearly more negative than 4 stars. And now I summed up the 1 and the 2 stars. You can see we go on here with unfortunately and the I perspective and the negations. And then, yes, we have, bored, stop, boring, disappointing, and too bad, and at all, and so on, disappointment. Interestingly, we also have realization, which is a Umsetzung. So the author realized, his idea probably didn't realize his idea properly, but it's kind of a judgment of, having ideas. It's kind of talking about the expertise of people, the expectations, the schemata that they bring to literature, and that they form their opinion on. So there's some overlap with the 4 and 3 stars. There is a difference to the 4 and 3 stars that I hinted on. So there is no degree, it's absolute statements. There is no concession and limitation. There is a strong negative balance. They do convey expectations, and they judge the formal dimension. But interestingly, by contrast to the other extreme rating, 5 stars, they are less emphatic. So there's less arousal, and this is possibly P, politeness. Something happened to the politeness. Okay, so summing up this, what people do is they express a fact, report experience, judge value, and they do so in using words in a quite distinctive way, actually supporting this idea of 5 stars being really different from the rest. So going back to the research question and the general background. So, these are, discussions, of course, going on, have been going on, and are, now under these increased, virtual conditions, or even picking up speed. So are we talking about a decline of intellectual scrutiny and differentiation with these popular genres, for example, with everybody commenting and judging literature? Is it maybe the rise of the standardized self? Has it to do with that, like rating everything, and also literature, and everything is kind of linked to buying and selling and so on. So this, capitalist logic. Well, we could actually answer that. There could be an opportunity here with these platforms, and including this metric externalization with a structuring function. And there seems to be a variability and diversity beyond certain reader prototypes that are, in the background here of this discussion. There seems to be a potential for personal insight and development, and there is the community dimension. As I said, of course, this is a specific way of talking about particular types of literature. We have to take this into account. But what we can see, from the research perspective, is also new ways of measuring schemata of literariness in readers. So finding out what readers really have in their minds about, literature, about fiction in natural discourse. It's a great opportunity to look at a lot of data and really find meaningful patterns. And also, starting to look at the textual forms and structures linking this kind of data to the literature, the literary and fictional data themselves. We can use the classification of rating and genre and so on. And of course, the description, which I just, reported on. At the beginning of which I just reported on. So we are actually now preparing another research, leg, as it were, looking at using machine learning for predicting the ratings on the basis of the text of the review. So, of course, I think I've made this clear. I've talked about this. So this is about carrying on the discussion about metric literary evaluation within literary studies. There is as I said, an avid discussion comparing these novel and lay readers to the professional ones also. It's about metric analysis generally for digital humanities, for fiction. And it's also, and this is moving one step, out of this specific research project, but a perspective that we find really interesting and that we actually entertain in our project, is the styles of thought, or the Forschungslogiken, as we call this project, that actually accompany the measuring. So, you know, the schemata that we as the researchers apply to what we do. Okay, I would like to close with an invitation. If you are interested in computational fiction studies, you know, digital literary studies of any kind, mixed methods, please come and join us at this special interest group of the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations. You can see the link there, and we'd be happy if you joined. So, obrigada.